Hugh, you're very welcome onto the show. How's it going, mate?
Thanks very much, John. Yeah, it's fine. Thank you. Nice to talk to someone in New York.
Okay, so you started. Did you start being a journalist in '89, or did you start covering the Troubles then?
Well, a bit of both. I had always had an interest in what was happening in Northern Ireland and Ireland, and because my both sets of grandparents were from Donegal, but had moved to Glasgow, and there is a tremendous connection between Glasgow and Donegal. So I was aware of I was aware of a lot of things that were happening, and I had relatives in Belfast. So I used to, anytime there was any literature on the go, I would get a look at it, and I was interested in politics as well.
Very good. When was it that you moved to Belfast?
1980, full time 1989, because I started to do some work for the BBC on a program that Martin Dillon started called Talkback, which is a current affairs program, which is still on the go 40 years later, 1989.
Can you characterize the this time in Belfast that you started covering the conflict? Like how would you characterize this kind of late '80s, early '90s time?
Well, it was almost the Anglo-Irish agreement had been signed in November uh, 85, and it was 40 years ago now, and it caused a serious rupture in the everyday life here because the unionists had not been included in the talks in the run up to the 1989 Anglo Irish Agreement. And for the first time in the history of the North, the political representatives and civil servants had a say from the Republic of Ireland, had a say in the ongoing governance of Northern Ireland, and it caused devastation within unionism. You had a total withdrawal of unionists from councils, and an antagonism then came right over the political scene. So it was a nasty enough thing, and that led directly to the formation of an upping of the loyalist game, and also the importation of arms that came in through groups like Ulster Resistance, and the other two groups, the UVF and the UDA, got their share of weapons from these massive consignments of weapons which arrived here.
I was going to say that the unionists would be kind of justified at the time in thinking that this was the beginning of them about to get shafted. Like it'll kind of start like this, and then they'll sell us out. It is understandable. Not
Yeah,
the not
in the
the
in the
not the violence.
vernacular of in the vernacular of the time, John, someone said to me at the time, and I've always remembered it, they thought they were going for their tea, which is a very Belfast way of saying things, that it's it's complete, they're finished,
Right. So yeah, obviously this time, a lot of people would associate it with this big increase in activity from the UFF, led at the time by Johnny Adair. Sam McCrory was obviously on the go. Did this make up like a good bit of the violence you were covering?
Yes, it did indeed. What I found most interesting, and I found this out in the run up to the 50th anniversary of the Troubles, when we were making a program for the BBC, or assisting in the making of a program of the Legacy series, and discovered that a cottage in Mid Ulster, which had been visited by the Reverend Ian Paisley in 1966, guns were picked up there and driven back to Belfast in the boot of Ian Paisley's car. And they were within weeks or even days. They were used in the 1966 shootings in Malvern Street in Belfast. And a lot of people saw that as one of the ingredients that you would say was the start of the troubles. The key was put in the engine and was about to be turned on fully at that moment. But what I discovered is that the same kitchen, exactly the same kitchen that Paisley was in that night, Johnny Adair stood in it in the late 80s, early 90s, and persuaded the old men of Ulster resistance to give him arms, which later were used in UFF killings. So it was quite remarkable that exactly the same house, and in fact the same kitchen, Adair stood in, and he managed to persuade. Johnny Adair naturally wouldn't have been comfortable in a very religious house, but these were old fundamentalist religious Protestants who listened to his plea for arms, and within weeks he started to receive them in Belfast.
These murders you're referring to in 1966, would these have been like just after John Patrick Scully and I can't think of her name, but that lady who
Yes, Matilda Gould.
yeah,
Matilda
these would have
Gould.
been following them, right?
They were all around the same time, within a space of about 2 or 3 weeks. Yes, they were. If you look at the book Loch's lives, they're all together, and that was the period where there was a. It was strangely enough, it was within the Ulster Unionist Party. There was a revolt against the Prime Minister, Captain Terence O'Neill, who realised that if the union was going to survive, they would have to modify their attitude towards the Catholic minority population. And a faction of the Ulster Unionist Party were opposed to this. And part of their plan was to create a thinking that the IRA, who were always the big bogey threat, were back in business. And these explosions started to happen. And they were being blamed on the IRA. But very quickly, the RUC realized these were actually the work of loyalists.
I was going to say people. It isn't incorrect, but like people mark the start of the troubles as being like summer '69, but in '66, these killings were definitely were definitely part. They definitely should be known.
Well,
Um,
if you remember Martin Dillon, he called these incidents the sparks that lit the bonfire, and he actually uh, made a program with that title.
Sorry, what you just told us a couple minutes ago there about Paisley, Paisley and his link to the guns that started this spark. Is
Mm.
this is this has this been published and kind of common knowledge or?
Yeah, well, I say it quite often, and I've written about it, and I'm actually sometime soon I will be publishing a booklet on Paisley's involvement in this. Now, uh, at the time, the RUC investigation, uh, some of the detectives involved, i.e., Leo McBrien, who charged Gusty Spence with murder, um, he wanted to charge Paisley with conspiracy to murder. But there was big discussion within the RUC, and on the advice of a man who later became a judge, a barrister by the name of Edward Warburton Jones, who had been an officer in the British Army during the World War II. He advised the prosecution service against bringing charges against Paisley. And the reason it's thought to be why is they kind of were afraid with Paisley's capacity and ability to tap into uh, Protestant fears, unfounded and ancient Protestant fears, uh, and they, they decided against. It wasn't worth the risk of stirring that up by charging Paisley. So he was never charged. But I can tell you, Leo McBrien, the detective who lived into his 90s, uh, told me that he believes it was a fundamental mistake on the part of the state not to charge Ian Paisley. But there you are, in time to come. He shared government with Martin McGuinness. In fact, many people say it was the most stable period of governance in the North. So you never know.
But you referred there to unfounded fears that the Protestant community had, as in a fear that one day the British government would leave them be part of Ireland, and then they would be a minority subject to what they
That's
subject
the
to happen.
fear. It's known as what do they call it? Like I forget the word. Surrounded by an enemy, and that's
Kind of like a siege
that's
mentality, a siege
siege.
mentality.
Exactly, that's the word I was looking for. It's known as the Unionist siege mentality, and when I first came here, John, I didn't believe it, but I believe it now. I came to realize it existed and was true. But they missed the boat. Something happened in 1964, which should have had the Unionists down on their knees thanking God, and that was there was a general election in '64, and for the first time, the Republican movement, who weren't even allowed to call themselves Sinn Féin, uh, stood as an independent Republican candidate, the man who had the job of being in charge of the IRA, which consisted of about around a dozen members. The gun was well away. They only had five, and three of them didn't work. And but they stood for election. Billy McMillan, Liam McMillan, was the Republican candidate in the '64 election. And the Unionists should have encouraged it because that was that was them accepting that Northern Ireland existed and that the border wasn't going to go away unless people were persuaded rather than coerced into doing away with the border. So that was a missed opportunity.
In fairness, like I don't. It's tough to know unless you're there. But like, I don't know if I call that like an unfounded fear. It certainly doesn't justify what some unionists did off the back of it. But like that is always quite a realistic possibility for them that Britain would kind of get sick of them and just leave them to be part of Ireland.
Yes, it was.
I've always found it a realistic fear. Like.
Yes, but my point about 1964 is there were no troubles happening in '64. The border campaign, the futile border campaign, had ended in ignominy in 1962, and so republicanism carried out under the guidance of a man called Cathal Golding had a moratorium, a reappraisal of the whole idea of republicanism in the 20th century. And a man called Mick Ryan, who later wrote a book, was published a few years ago called My Life in the IRA, which was the only, so far, the only first-hand account of the border campaign. So Mick, I interviewed Mick about this. He was given the job by Goulding to travel around the country and assess the state of the Republican movement. And he came back to Dublin and they had a meeting. I think they used to hold meetings under the auspices of things like the Wolf Tone Society, which was really a think tank for the IRA. And Cahill called the meeting to order and said Mick has completed his his tour of the country, assessing the state of the movement, and he's about to address us with this. Mick, what have you got to report? And he said, well, the state of the movement, Cahill, is you don't have a movement. There is no movement. That was Cal Golding. Cal Golding's instruction to Mick Ryan, and his report 3 weeks later was, you don't have a movement. People are not interested. There was a kind of, yes, there may have been not a romantic, because it's always a political possibility, but there was a notion that they were still believed in a unitary state, but they didn't think that the gun was in the modern era the way to do it. But it wasn't acknowledged, you know.
Getting back into like your own career, I wanted to ask you a lot about getting sources and keeping them, because I'd imagine that's like the lifeblood of a journalist, especially one who's covering like paramilitary groups and so on. Is there like a most common way that you ended up like getting these sources that you would work with throughout your career?
Well, it's a good question, John, but I was a bit different in as much as I didn't have a job as a reporter. I basically had my own income. I was working at the BBC writing songs for Martin's excellent current affairs program, and I I did a lot of reading, and I tried to make contact with people who would have been witness to important periods. And often I knocked their door and was often taken in and able to speak for hours about what had happened in the past. And I was able to maintain these contacts over a period of time. People that I met 40 years ago would still be on good terms with me, and were able to I'm able to rely on their knowledge, and that's how I did it.
So would it be common to pay sources, like even throw them a few pound to fellas who would give you bits of information here and there?
No, we never did that. I never did that, but I know it was done in some circumstances, and then you'll always get greedy people who ask. But by and large, people spoke to me because they wanted to.
We'll say like once you've been at it like a couple of years and got established and stuff, would you have had would you have had like an ear in every camp, so to speak? Would you have had like someone you could talk to in the Falls Road IRA, as well as somewhere in North Belfast, as well as this crowd and that crowd and that crowd?
Yeah, it's very important to have as many contacts as you have, and as you say, in different camps. It was because of the nature of the violence here. People didn't have a lot of dealings with the police because, I mean, any dealings the police could get you into trouble, and so I had to work out how I was going to do that, because I realized that was an important element. And I mean, I can tell you this because this is how it happened, and the man's dead now. But um, if you remember in '93, the Shankill bomb went off. The provisional IRA put this bomb, killed all the people on the Shankill Road. And
Target.
a week later, exactly, the UFF walk into a pub in Greysteel, County Derry, and machine gun the people inside it, killed 8 people. And so, because I had been on the ground at that time, I realized that it was a very important time, because the place kind of wobbled, John. It was a possibility. I was always aware that this place, if certain things had happened, negative things, it could have slipped into a sort of Beirut's type situation with gun gangs roaming the street. So that was a period where I really felt that. And I was at, at Greysteel in the cemetery uh, when John Hume cried. Everyone speaks about this. It was filmed. And John Hume, who had been under intense strain, uh, trying to bring the provisional IRA in from the cold and get them to start thinking in a solely political way. But so John Hume was in the cemetery, standing quite near me. The coffins were being put into the grave, and the strain must have caught up in him, and he started to cry, and that was filmed. And I remember thinking, God, this is never seen John Hume like that before. Anyway, I followed the events, and on the final day of the Greysteel killer's trial, I was in the court, and I saw the accused. They were found guilty, and they all shook hands in the dock, although one of them had given information on the others, and he was kept separately from the other two by two prison officers. But the others stretched over beyond the prison officers and wanted the other fella with them. They shook hands with him. You know, if you were in the court, you would have seen this. So that was so that was finished. They were taken down, and it was in the old Crumlin Road courthouse where they were literally taken down below the court and into a tunnel that took them beneath the road. And when they emerged on the other side, they were in Crumlin Road jail. It was an amazing bit of architecture. But when I stepped outside, standing in the hall of Crumlin Road Court on its own was Detective Superintendent Eric Anderson, who had been in charge of the investigation and led it very well, and they got all the right people. And I walked over to him and introduced myself. And I said, just as a citizen here, Mr. Anderson, I want to thank you for a good policing job well done. And I said, what's your name? And I said, Hugh Jordan. And he said, Hugh Jordan, come up to police headquarters at 2:00 this afternoon, and I'll tell you all about it. So I couldn't believe my luck. And I did as I was asked and went to police headquarters. I took the risk or chance my arm by bringing a photographer along with me. And Mr. Anderson showed me all the guns and told me the entire story and how he was driving home one night and a young detective constable detected something because they had rounded up the usual suspects. And one of the guys who was in custody was arrested along with his wife. And his wife gave a different version of events from him. So the constable separated the two of them. And they phoned Eric Anderson, who was on his way home from Derry to Belfast when he got the message. And this detective had the news to take this further. And Anderson went back up, and they cracked it. The guy told them everything, and that's how they broke it. And they also told me another thing that day, that the getaway car had been driven into a field, and it was to be set on fire. But the driver of it, Torrens Knight, who later went to jail for life, he had previously tried to burn a car, found it more difficult than it seems. And when he threw the petrol on it, he burned himself. So he was wary of this. So when he was trying to burn the Greysteel car, he kept the driver's window only open a couple of inches, and he threw in the match to light it, and then he ran away. But there wasn't enough oxygen getting into the car, and the flames went out. So they needed to make a connection to the car, and they needed the key for it to prove that he had used it. And a team of Scottish soldiers made a thin khaki line across a field next to the car and walked very slowly through the field. And one of them found a set of car keys. They put them in the car and it opened it. And that proved the link that was the car, and Torrance Knight fingerprints were on the key. So it linked him directly to the car. So I learned all that from Mr. Anderson. And in other times, I was interested in things. I was able to speak to him and other police officers who trusted me that I wouldn't abuse what I was being told.
Just for the sources you would have inside paramilitary groups, would most of these fellas be, would say, acting independently, as in not, as in like their bosses don't know that they're talking to a.
Yeah, very much so, very much so, and that's the best way to work. People are giving you stuff on trust, and you've got to be able to protect your sources and make sure that other people don't know that you were talking to them.
Did it ever get like almost nasty with a source where maybe they got the wrong idea or maybe got the right idea and thought that maybe not on purpose, or you might have neglected their trust, or maybe put them at risk. Did you ever get accused of that?
Not that I can think of, but you're quite right to point out that you need to be ultra careful about protecting your sources. It's especially in a life or death situation, like you would get here.
I was going to ask you, did you ever get any threats from any paramilitary groups? I just that made remember that were you the only journalist with a personal protection weapon?
No, I think myself and Liam Clark from the Sunday Times both fitted into that category for a while. Yeah.
What was that? I guess the first part of the question: did you ever get threats from these various groups?
Well, still do, even as recently as I would say about 2 months ago. The police phoned me when I'd gone down to Balnahinch, quite near Belfast, to buy a book that I was interested in. I'd seen it for sale on the internet. On the way back, the police phoned me and said they wanted to come and see me. And it was about a threat being made against me. And the police were about to arrest this individual. And they wanted to know if they did arrest him and charge him, would I be willing to give evidence? And I said yes. So it's one of these things that you have to live with in the North.
What was this fella, if you don't mind going into it, was this fella acting on behalf of a group?
Yeah. But he maybe was a bit silly in the way he went about it, because the way he did it was kind of public.
Was it a Republican or Loyalist group? Again,
Loyalist.
And I guess I'm thinking back, like back in the day. Did you were there any, we'll say threats that were almost acted on, like maybe
Well,
they discovered?
well, again, I managed to miss a lot of that, but I had colleagues. When I first started at the Sunday World, the Northern editor was Jim Campbell, and in 1984, he had been seriously shot by the UVF. And then our colleague Martin O'Hagan was shot dead by a breakaway group from the UVF. They called themselves the LVF, and Martin was shot dead walking home with his wife. So, you never know how close you missed it, or by how much you missed it. But they were very, very real. And my other colleague, Jim McDowell, was often talked about he received more warnings from the police than he could paper the walls with in his house, you know. So all of this happened, and his family were also threatened.
When was it that you did get your? I assume it was a pistol for your protection weapon.
Yeah, when would it have been? In the 90s, you know, the 90s.
What was it? What was it on the back of a specific threat, or you were just kind of getting a bunch of them, or?
Well, I was contacted by the police again. It was a specific night, and the police phoned me, and I was driving home, and they said that when they got home, I would be at my, the police would be at my home waiting for me, and they were, and they told me I was under a serious threat that night, and they asked me to, was I able to find alternative accommodation, and they would see me the next day, and I said yes, and then they came to see me, and they told me more about it, and they wanted me to implement some security measures, and that was one of them.
What was the group threatening you?
Strangely enough, it wasn't a paramilitary group. It was drug dealers. Yeah, who were at that time were well capable, as you would know from things that happened in your own hometown, that the paramilitaries are well capable of, or drug dealers well capable of organising violence against reporters if they wanted it.
What incident in my hometown were you referring to? You mean Cork?
Oh, sorry, I've made that up. I thought I mixed you up with Dublin for some reason or others. I
Oh,
forgot
sorry,
that.
sorry.
That's my fault.
And
Yeah,
you're referring, of course, to Veronica Guerin.
Veronica Guerin. Yeah, I remember well the day that happened. Yeah.
That was what, 94, 93?
Um, I, I think it was after that. I just can't remember the actual date.
I know I was very young. I was born in 93, and I think Veronica Guerin and Sophie Toscan de Plantier were murdered in the same year. They're two of the most famous female murders in.
No, it must have been after 93. Must have been after
Oh yeah,
93.
no, it was after three. I just know that I was very, very young. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It was because I knew Eric Anderson by then, and I was on my way to meet him when someone from the BBC phoned me to say she had been murdered. Yeah.
It must have been quite like a stress in your life and a weight on your shoulders when you would find out about these threats.
Yes, yes, of course. Well, plus you have to carry on with your job. You know, you just can't pack up and do something else. You know, you're kind of lumbered with it. But it's part of your duty is to look after yourself and not put yourself in danger. So over the years, that's what I did. I gave up alcohol, so I wasn't going to be vulnerable in pubs or anything like that. So that's that's one of the major things that I did.
I see. I see. Did you ever get the sense that any of your sources were like playing you, so to speak, like they were giving you half truths or selective truths or just lies in order to use you as
Yes,
chess
yes,
piece?
that happens. That happens a lot, John. Not a lot. No, it doesn't happen a lot, but it happens, and it happened to me. And I'm sure it happens with. I'm sure it happens with reporters. I mean, you've got to set out here in the north. You've got to realise that almost everyone has an agenda. So, so you once you work that out, and then of course you're quite right. People would have uh, thought they could have spun a story in a certain way that would have an effect on someone who they were opposed to. So you have to work out, and I'm sure I have maybe been unwittingly used in that way, but I try to do my best to see through it.
Was there any groups that were paramilitary groups, I mean, who were like more willing to work with you, and some who were like on the opposite end of that spectrum would only do it kind of begrudgingly?
Well, most don't, right? Most don't want to work with you or talk to you. And what happens is it's usually on recommendation. If someone else recommends to them that they know you and you could be trusted to be interviewed and made aware of certain things that they normally wouldn't make a reporter aware of. So I found that to be a great help.
You hear these stories sometimes about like maybe a journalist or just someone who's writing a book about a paramilitary group, and they're taken to a meeting, but they're like they have a hood over, their eyes covered, and they're driven around in circles, so they don't know where they're going. Yeah, has that ever that happened to you?
No, it never happened to me, and I wouldn't have been keen to comply with any of those requests. And thank God it didn't happen. But I know it did happen. And I was well aware of incidents like that, but I wouldn't have been agreeable to enter into any nonsense like that, you know.
I guess by the time you were working as a journalist, the INLA and IPLO were fairly diminished given their feuding, but still, you know, not inactive or anything. Would them two groups have had the willingness to speak to you as I don't know, like the IRA or some of the loyalists?
No, I never had any dealings with the INLA apart from one, and that was Jim McDowell, my boss, had asked me, would I accompany him to a meeting with the INLA, and we met them. But it wasn't a pleasant operation. They were complaining about a story that had appeared in the paper, not written by me or Jim, but they were complaining about that it was inaccurate, and they were fairly nasty. But we gave a good account of ourselves, and but we were aware that it was an intimidation. It was an attempt to intimidate us, and it wasn't pleasant at all. But we got through it, and the I wouldn't say they went away with their tails between their legs, but they realized that we weren't going to be intimidated. And later, as is often the way, both of these individuals were shot dead by their own by a further fallout within these groups.
Were like in general, were Republicans or loyalists more or less willing to talk to journalists, or are you at least?
I would certainly say people on the Republican side learned a lot quicker that if you've got a message to get out, you're better being on friendly terms, at least with the messenger, rather than being hostile and threatening to them. And I found that. But again, like, you know, these people just didn't arrive one day and be loyalist killers on earth. If you work away at it and 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 get them to lighten up a little, it's amazing what the change that you'll have in some people. I mean, I you know, there's a number of loyalist paramilitaries that would have had no time for me, wouldn't even have spoken to me, but they do after a period of time. That happened quite often. One of my assets I used to think about anyway was I'm from Glasgow originally, John, and of course the two football clubs in Glasgow represent quite different attitudes to life, and I was a Celtic supporter, and I never hid it. and I would discuss football with the Rangers fans, and I think certainly here within loyalism, they quite respected that in me because I didn't hide it. I didn't try to say, "Oh, I'm a Partick Thistle fan." I said, "No, no, I'm a Celtic supporter," and once they get used to that you're not you're not going to change your attitude to it, that they accept it. Okay.
You wrote an article, I think fairly recently, where you were contrasting your dealings with two of the more infamous informers or touts in the Troubles history. These being Willie Carlin and Ray Gilmour. And
Yeah.
you said you had they were very different in the way they operated and their professionalism, for lack of a better term. Can you tell us about dealing with these two?
Yeah, well, they were two very different people. And Willie was a much more sophisticated individual than Raymond Gilmour. He was Raymond Gilmour was a big lump of a boy who kind of looked like a policeman, and the, the the police in the Northwest who recruited him persuaded him that he was one of them, and they said the only difference is you don't have a uniform. And they told me they told him that, and he went to work for them, and he was one of what they called the supergrass uh, witnesses, where they were rounded up in droves, and he gave evidence against his former friends, and the judge quite rightly identified Raymond Gilmour as an untrustworthy liar, and he found them all not guilty. And but they had been on remand in custody for a long time, and I can tell you as a fact now, the IRA in Derry never really got going again because Raymond Gilmour, for all his lies and exaggerations, uh, it ripped the heart out of them. Because once you've gone to jail and you're on remand, you wouldn't be that keen to go back. And so, what I would say to you is the war was over in Derry long before it was over elsewhere, largely as a result of the work of Eamon Gilmour and Willie Carlin. But Willie was a different kind of person because he had been a soldier. He came from Cregan. And when he walked into a recruiting office in Derry, as they used to have them on the street in the late 50s, early 60s. And he wanted to join the British Army. And he was going to join the local recruiting, the local regiments, the Royal Irish, and the Irish Rangers, I think they were called at that time, mostly working class lads. But some recruiting sergeant in the offices spotted that Willie was maybe sharper tool than some of the others, and they recommended that he apply to the Royal Irish Hussars, which are a cavalry regiment. Like they drove tanks, and he joined the Royal Irish Hussars. So, and he told me that when he came back home, he wore his Hussars uniform. They had a distinctive uniform, but he walked up Cregan Hill and walked around the estate in his British Army uniform, and many others did. It was there was no fear of it. A few years later, it would have got you killed, and it did get people killed. A boy called Ranger Best was 18 years of age. Willie Best was shot dead by the official IRA. Would you believe? But it ended the official IRA, amongst other things. It ended the official IRA in Derry. His murder. It was an appalling thing. But So Willie was a much more sophisticated soul, and he wanted to come back home. He very much missed Derry. A lot of Derry men are very suspicious about them, their relationship with their mothers. Their mothers look after them all their lives. And and he wanted to come home, but he realized things had changed. So he spoke to his bosses and they asked him to speak to someone else. And Willie was recruited by MI5 to go and work for them. But it was a very clever operation. He was asked to make inquiries locally. Would it be safe enough for him to come home? His family were well known in the area. And if he got the go ahead with that, he was told to go back home and lie low for a couple of years. Don't do anything. And eventually, and he did that, he made inquiries and he was told he'd come back home and just be a normal citizen. And after a couple of years, he was told to get involved in community groups, which were all the rage at the time. Of course, a lot of them were controlled by Sinn Féin. And Willie was good at it. He was better. He could keep books. He could organize meetings. He could address meetings. And then he was asked to join Sinn Féin. Big thing, former soldier. But he joined. And he was told to do nothing apart from political. So that's what he did. But of course, one of his workers, one of his colleagues, was the famous Martin McGuinness. And he became an advisor. So you had a British Army agent, an MI5 agent, being an advisor to a senior guy in the IRA, who at one stage was the chief of staff of the IRA. And Willie's job was to copy every political development that Sinn Féin was involved in. And, he told me when Martin stood for the what they call the assembly in the North before this one, he wanted to, he suggested to Martin that the media had changed and politics had changed, that you had to be more media savvy. So he told Martin he should change his image from an iron jumper wearing individual with jeans and boots on, or to smarten himself up. Martin agreed. So they didn't want to go around the shops of Derry, and there weren't that many because Martin's men had blown them all up. So they travelled the 20 miles to Letterkenny in Donegal. The main street in Letterkenny in those days had several draper shops on the main street, and they would hang up the clothes outside the shop. And Willie takes Martin in to look around these gents' sports jackets, they called them. And Willie was trying to pick something out for Martin, and he looked round, and Martin had a jacket on, sports jacket, with leather patches on the elbows. And Willie said, "Get that off, Martin. You look like an old man." And Martin said, "I think it's great. I think it makes me look like a school teacher," said Martin McGuinness. So in Martin's life at that time, the most successful thing he probably knew was someone who had become a school teacher. And anyway, Willie smartened Martin McGuinness up. And then he went on to become, certainly in terms here, he was a man of charm and ability, and as was evidenced by his relationship with the Reverend Ian Paisley. They were known as the Chuckle Brothers because they got on so well. And so Willie did all that, but all the time every development was copied and given to the British through his handler, MI5. handler.
You actually like met with these two, right? Not
With,
separately, obviously.
with who?
With Gilmour and with Carlin.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, by the time I was in Derry, Gilmour was away. He had been the Supergrass trials had collapsed, and Gilmour was given money and was away, and so was Carlin. Carlin had come very very close to getting caught. But what I did was I brought Gilmour back to Derry, and I met him in County Down, Newcastle County Down, and we did a series of interviews there, and I persuaded him to come with me the next day to Derry. But the plan was to go in early and leave early, and we did that. We drove to Derry. I suppose we're on the streets around 7 o'clock in the morning, but it was in the summer, so the sun was up, and uh, Raymond Gilmour loved being back in his hometown, and he was striking up conversations with the odd person he would meet in the street because he wanted to hear the local. He was talking to the bin men at one point, the guys collecting bins, and we took several pictures of him down in the bogsides, and it was quite remarkable. And the following day after the story appeared, I received a phone call from BBC Radio Foyle, and the reporter said to me, "It must have been very early in the streets because in the pictures you have of him, there's not many people about." So I said, "Well, of course we did it very early because did you expect me to put an advert in the Derry Journal to say he was coming, sign autographs or something like that?" So that was that. But Willie Carlin, he walked the walk, and his information certainly uh, was able to show the British government that, and Thatcher in particular was the beneficiary of this, that there was a movement, a growing movement within the Republican movement towards politics, and it was there to be exploited. And that's the road they went down.
I'm always interested in these fellas who weren't okay. So when the conflict ends, they're not so old that they're kind of done with like dangerous activities, but they have a skill set that will say this conflict required, but it's not required of them anymore. And they use it in criminality. I'm referring to like Desi O'Hare, Tommy Savage, and Declan Duffy, Whacker Duffy. You'd hear plenty of stories about them even in like the Dublin underworld. But these are fellas who honed a skill set during a conflict, and then they came out at the end of that conflict, and the conflict like didn't need their skill set anymore. Did you cover some of these fellas?
Yeah, yeah, I did at the time, and you're quite right. Uh, the day the IRA ceasefire was called was quite remarkable, particularly in Belfast, because it was the slowest ceasefire coming. Everybody knew it was coming for at least a year. If you remember, the Shankill bomb had happened a week later, grey steel. There was this late power surge within the two paramilitary camps. And then you were starting to wonder, will we ever get a ceasefire? Are things just going to get worse? But then within the year, the ceasefire, so in 94, we get the ceasefire. But that particular day was remarkable because down the Falls Road came a fleet of black taxis, which were associated with the Republican movement. Many of the drivers were had been Republican prisoners. And so we were treated to this bizarre moment, which had echoes of a similar ceasefire in the Middle East, where the Palestinian revolutionaries were firing guns in the air. But you couldn't do that in the Falls Road. So they came down the Falls Road with Irish tricolors out the windows and people cheering. And then this meeting in Andersonstown, which is an unusual place as well. It's in the west of the city, and in many ways, the Andersonstown, which would have been a village, became the alternative Belfast city centre. Everything that was needed was there. So Republicans didn't need to go into Belfast city centre for anything. And so you had this surge down to Andersonstown with the black taxis, people waving, cheering, and then people handing Gerry Adams bouquets of flowers, and so that again fed the unionist paranoia. What's going on? What have they been promised? What have they got? They assumed again, once again, wrongly. But in actual fact, they got nothing. But it was a great piece of performance art because everyone, including myself, thought they must have got more than they got. The truth was they got nothing. But so after following the ceasefires, many people who had been active in the IRA found out that there was no longer a need for them. And gradually, as the time passed, they ended up kind of crying into their beer in pubs in West Belfast. It was only the people with a nose for politics became very much involved in Sinn Féin. And it has to be said that it was a rise in Sinn Féin. And there was a rise in Sinn Féin votes. People were quite prepared to give them a vote, whereas they maybe wouldn't have supported what they called armed struggle. And but that's what happened. People were disappointed, and a smaller group went towards criminality.
Can you talk to us a bit about Cameron Hastie? He was a soldier who was found to have passed information. I think that both UVF and UDA and his actions resulted in an innocent Catholic man getting murdered. Was it you who broke it? Who broke that story?
Yeah, I did that not so long ago, really. But the big thing was Cameron Hastie. He became he ended up a major in the army, and he had been he was a Scottish soldier, and on a Sunday evening they would go for a drink in one of the barracks, and on North Belfast, really, and some local women, loyalist women, were invited in, and they would go in for a drink, and some of them were in the Ulster Defence Regiment, and there was a incredible link between the Ulster Defence Regiment in certain areas with loyalist paramilitaries, because it was a way to become familiar with weapons for a start. And anyway, there became a trading of information where women who were in the UDR would be drinking with British soldiers, and information was passed on through the women that directly went to loyalist paramilitaries, and some people died as a result of that quality of intelligence transfer. So I became aware of Hastie, and I tracked down one of the women who had been passing or recipient of the information, and I just knocked her door, and she told me. She conceded that she had been involved in that, and she knew Hastie well and liked him, and he was charming, and but that was the way it worked, and we we got a nice picture of Hastie in his uniform, I think, and it was on the front page, and the headline was "Major Collusion." So I never really got talking to him, though. He avoided me successfully, but we had enough um, information to prove that it was correct.
When did you speak to this woman?
That was all. I don't know. It might have, if it was 3 years ago, that was it. Yeah. Mm.
So not back then. Wow, she had no problem. She had no problem just kind of admitting it to you.
She nearly fainted. First of all, she thought it was all past and gone, but she for some reason or other just decided to tell the truth, and she knew she knew the what it was about. You know.
You had a good story when we spoke on the phone the other day. You told me I guess kind of a funny story about but one of the RUC officers who interrogated Robert Basher Bates of the Shankill Butchers.
Yeah. Well, Robert Basher Bates was a member of the gang who infamously became known as the Shankill Butchers, led by the guy called what was his name again? Lenny Murphy. Lenny Murphy, and but Bates played a senior role, and he actually had held the butcher's knives. He kept them in his home, and when Murphy went to jail, he gave orders to his two lieutenants, who in Martin Dillon's book became known as Mr. A and Mr. B. And then one of them emerged later. We were able to name him John Alexander Murphy. He was Lenny's brother. So he was given instructions to keep the killings going. And Robert Basher Bates was one of the men who ensured that that happened. So anyway, this story is about how they cracked Basher's role in the Shankill Butchers killings. He had been arrested numerous times and had said nothing. And a fella that I knew, again, he's dead now, one of the team of detectives who were selected to try and smash the Shankill Butchers gang, was a guy called Philip Boyd. He was known as Bogey Boyd, Philip Bogey Boyd. And he was ordered to arrest Bates. And he did. He brought him to Castlereagh Holding Centre. And he settled down for what he thought would have been a no contact, no comment interview, because they were sophisticated at those times. And Philip told me he sat down and brought his pipe out. I mean, you wouldn't be able to do it there because of the smoking restrictions, but he filled his pipe laboriously as the interviewer, as the interviewee sat silence, and he filled his pipe and got his match ready, got his pipe lit up, and he's looking at Basher. And to start the conversation, he said, "You're fucked this time, Basher." And he told me himself, he said, at that moment, I detected something in his eyes, just the look of him. And he was deadly serious. And the policeman never spoke. And then Basher, quite quietly, said to him, "Bogey," he called him his nickname. He said, "Bogey, go and tell my wife where I am. And when you come back, I'll tell you everything." Now, Philip had to make a decision. He said to me, I didn't want to go and tell his wife because it meant I was going to have to drive through peak time traffic in Belfast, both there and back. But I decided to do it because I trusted this look, my judgment of this look in his eye. So he drove through put him back in his cell, drove through Belfast, told Basher's wife, who was a Christian woman, who fainted. She took ill. He had to hold her and get help people had to come and take her, look after her. And he went back to East Belfast, the holding centre, took Bashar out of his cell, and therein became an in-depth confession to several murders. And I think Bashar was convicted of something like 9 or 11 murders, possibly. And that's how that happened. Just that incredible intuition of Philip Boyd knowing that Bashar had had enough and he wanted to come clean. Now, Bashar became an interesting aside, came up the other day. I was talking to a former police officer, a prison officer who dealt with Bashar Bates in jail. And we always used to joke that loyalist paramilitaries in particular found God once they were in jail. They never found him before, but they found him in jail. But it was a ruse to get themselves a lighter sentence. But this guy told me just the other day that he believed Bashar's conversion to Christianity was actually sincere. And I said, well, what do you base that on? And he said, well, when I would be passing his cell and he didn't know that I was passing his cell, I would have a wee look in and he would be kneeling in prayer. And he said, so that convinced me. And the way in later life as a prisoner, he dealt with things. He was a much calmer, more decent individual. But of course, he was a victim of his own crimes, and he was later shot dead by the son of one of his victims. There you are.
You had a somewhat kind of humorous story about an RUC officer and Danny Morrison, who people would know as being I think was he a publicity director for Sinn Féin? Was that his?
Sinn Féin, yeah, yeah. He That's funny you mentioned that, because the detective that I was speaking about, Philip Boyd, I was attending his funeral, and I had arranged to meet another policeman called Superintendent Tim McGregor, and I'd arranged to meet him in a wine bar in town, and I I said I'll see you there later on after the funeral. Now, as one of the cases he had worked on years ago, he had charged Danny Morrison. He was charged and convicted, and then later the conviction was quashed. But Tim McGregor had investigated the Danny Morrison. He was convicted in connection with a tout, an informer called Sandy Lynch, and he went to jail. I can't remember what his sentence was, but he went to jail, and as I say, the conviction was later quashed. But Tim McGregor had said to me that in those days they used to have a court artist. They weren't allowed to show people's picture on television, so the court artist would go in and have a look at the accused and come out and draw a sketch of the person that they saw in the witness box or the dock. And he had done that with Tim McGregor, sketched the policeman, and he'd also sketched Danny Morrison. And he gave McGregor the sketches when he was finished, and they'd lain in his house and for years. And he said to me, Hugh, Danny's out. He said, if you ever bump into him, tell him I've got this sketch of him and I should give him it. And I said, well, we'll do that someday. And lo and behold, I went into this wine bar, and there was Danny with his wife. They were going to go for a meal. It was a nice place. And I said, Danny, you won't believe this. There's a friend of mine coming down to see me who you know. He said, who's that? And I said, well, wait till you see him when he comes in. So Tim had nipped home, because I told him Danny was there. Tim had nipped home and picked up the sketch of Danny, which was in the frame, nice little wooden frame. And he brought it in. It was wrapped up in a black bin bag. And he came over and I said, Danny, you remember this man? This is Superintendent Tim McGregor. And Danny said, Superintendent, you must have been promoted because of me, because he was an inspector when he dealt with Danny. And Tim said, there's absolutely no doubt about that, Danny. That's how I got my promotion. But anyway, he gave him the present, and Danny brought it out from the bin bag. God, he stared at it. He knew exactly what it was. And anyway, he liked that, and he later wrote a book. He wrote a book and mentioned that little incident in the book. You know.
Did you guys? I guess you in particular. Did you kind of out Slab on the front page following Canary Wharf?
Following the Canary Wharf bomb, which was in '96, it broke the ceasefire. As you know, 2 people were killed that night: a man cleaner and a man who ran a newspaper shop. And the following day, or as the dust settled, literally on Canary Wharf, our boss in Dublin, Colin McGinty, the editor of the Sunday World, decided it was time that we should name the IRA Army Council, because no one in Ireland, he pointed out, north or south, had ever voted for the IRA Army Council. These are not democratic institutions. And Colin McGinty thought it was our duty as a big selling Irish newspaper that we should inform the people of Ireland about the names of these people who broke the peace. And I volunteered to be involved in this and set about compiling the information, which a week later we put on the front page, that we named the IRA Army Council. So it was a bit of hard work, okay, doing it all, but we got it done, and it was a bit of a milestone in Irish journalism because no one had ever done it before. So the following day, I received a phone call from a senior man in the BBC in Belfast who admired what we had done, and he wanted to do the same with the BBC. Now, there were restrictions on him, and it looked at one stage as though the programme was not going to see the light of day, but it did, and it came out as a Newsnight special on BBC Two. So it was quite historic in its own way.
Would you consider say like the remnants of the various paramilitary groups, Republican and Loyalist in the north? Would you consider them kind of like kind of just criminals, really?
Well, what happened after the ceasefires was the Loyalist paramilitaries in particular continued to recruit in even greater numbers. I couldn't believe it, that they were, of course, but they made money from increasing their ranks because they all were obliged to pay dues. So this was an incredible thing that no one had anticipated, but they did. And of course, at that time, the Loyalist paramilitaries many of them were involved in drugs distribution. And the people who thought they were joining paramilitary groups, in actual fact, turned out to be small-time drug dealers. So this is something that happened, but it was an interesting phenomenon. But I think they're on the run now because the government, even last week, were heavily criticised for ploughing money into loyalist groups where there are accusations of criminality and drug dealing in particular.
Um, of the two books that you've written, I suppose the more well known one is about Johnny Adair. He's obviously not the biggest fan of it. We both know that. But your relationship with him kind of got repaired or patched up through something which is actually kind of rather touching, if you want to go into that.
Well, as far as the UFF faction of loyalism was concerned, over the years, I got to know Sam Skelly McCrory very, very well. And we all know he had a very close relationship with Johnny Adair going back to their school days. So I knew Sam quite well. And Sam spoke to me anytime I wanted to speak to him. And we were both football fans. And he was a Rangers fan. I was a Celtic fan. But he knew plenty about football. In fact, one of his uncles had played for Northern Ireland in the 1956 World Cup. A guy called Samuel McCrory, same name as himself. In fact, he had scored a goal in that 58, I think it was, in Sweden. He had scored a goal for Northern Ireland then. And so I got to know Sam very well, and I found him to be very honest with me, as much as he could be, about incidents. And he also had good observations of human beings who had become involved in paramilitaries. He was a good judge of character, having a bad character himself. He was a good judge of character. But he when Johnny Adair lost a son to drugs, and I wrote an article about it, and basically said that no human being uh, should have to stand at the graveside of their child. And I mean, I could be wrong, but I think in some way that touched Johnny Adair, maybe at the behest of Sam. But very gradually we got on talking terms. And when I was in Scotland doing some recording with Sam, I went for a walk to kill some time, and Johnny Adair was there, and he came with me. And we had a long talk about his role and the organization that he headed. And he gave me his version of events and the reasons why he became involved. And funnily enough, it comes up 40 years ago last Sunday, when was the actual date of the huge loyalist rally in the centre of Belfast, when Paisley had this, it became known as the Ulster Says No rally. And Paisley famously said, never, 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 never. He said it 4 times, said it too often, once too often. But that day was a seminal moment. And last Sunday, I did an interview with Johnny Adair about his memory of that day. He was 22 years of age, but he had come, he's now 62. He had come into town as a young paramilitary. And he confessed that his friend Sam McCrory had broken into SS Moore's sports shop and liberated thousands of, or hundreds, if not thousands, of golf balls, which they always thought they bounced the same way as they did on television. On the grass, they just bounced for a few yards. But they found when they bounced them on the hard concrete, they bounced really far. And it was a great way for as a weapon against the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And if you see film footage of that time, you'll see the golf balls flying around. And funny, SS Moors only recently announced 2 weeks ago that they were going to close down after 75 years in business. But that was a seminal moment for Adair. And I did get to know him from not knowing him at all to him disliking what he saw in the book and to on talking terms. And then I interviewed him a few things about very different things away from paramilitarism. Like, I mean, one very humorous thing was when Tina Turner died. I interviewed him about Tina because they used to use her song "Simply the Best" as their kind of battle cry, and of course the interview Adair told me that he, he received the UDA received a letter from Tina's solicitors saying she didn't want him to to use this song anymore. So that was an interesting piece of history as well. But of course, a lot of people forget, John, don't really know that Mr. Adair himself was a musician for a period of time, and he played in a punk band called
Along,
Offensive Weapon.
alongside McCrory, right?
Yes, yes. Sam was a singer, and after a fashion, I use that word loosely, but and Adair was the bass player, and so I felt that he was a bit disappointed in Tina's criticism because he felt an affinity with her, having been a musician himself, you know.
I'm not referring to Johnny here or anything, but have you ever spoken to any ex-paramilitaries who, when you meet them, you feel like you're in the presence of like a cold-blooded killer or someone who's like sociopathic or psychopathic? That apparently, like with some people, you can kind of feel the air around them. Do you know what I mean? You must have met fellas like that.
Well, of course. And one thing I always remember, John, is we spoke about it earlier today, the Shankill bomb and the Loyalist reply of Grey Steel. So, as I say, Eric Anderson and his team of detectives rounded up the usual suspects, and within that, they found the killers and charged them with murder. Now, they arrested one man who went to Castlereagh and did not say a word. And a week later, he was allowed out and he went home and he never faced any charges. But I interviewed him and he told me that on the day he was released, a policeman came into his cell or into the interview room and threw down on the desk a copy of the newspaper. And on the front of it, this is days after Grey Steel, threw down on the table a copy of the newsletter. And on the front of the newspaper, Gerry Adams had said, maybe for the first time, this can't continue. We cannot have this level of violence in our society. And the policeman said to the Loyalist, maybe, just effing maybe, he said, some good will come out of this. And that was maybe the first seeds of what became the peace process. So, but what a point I'm making to you is all the people who did the damage went to jail for a long time. They get out under the Good Friday Agreement. But in amongst them and walking home was the man who planned it in order for them to do it. So he had that cold-blooded killer image for me because I knew that he had planned it. But he went home and was never convicted in connection with it.
But back to Adair and Skelly. You told me when we spoke before that one of the top RUC guys, Ronnie Flanigan, you believe that he kind of doggedly pursued Adair because they were actually from a similar area themselves.
Well, I have a theory. It's not been confirmed by Mr. Flanagan or anyone else. I have to say that. But Ronnie Flanagan's a very interesting man. And as far as I'm concerned, he's a man of history because he was a Belfast guy. He played rugby for Ulster. He knew Belfast well. He told me when he was a student, uh, Divis Flats, which is still there, the Divis Tower was being built, and he worked as what they called a nipper. He was a tea boy on that building site when Celtic in 1967 won the European Cup. So it was a Thursday night, and they all finished work early, and he watched Celtic win the European Cup in a pub called the Spanish Rooms on Divis Street, which is the continuation of the Falls Road. And it's also very near Protestant West Belfast, within walking distance. So Mr. Flanagan told me several Protestants from the Shankill were in the pub as well. And he said, Hugh, they cheered on Celtic to win the European Cup that night. Make no mistake about that. But how I got on talking terms with Ronnie Flanigan was I was walking through Belfast one day, and a guy that I know called Dennis Smith, who was a kind of left-wing historian, and he said to me, Hugh, I think you should look at something. There was a dock strike in Belfast in 1907, and James Connolly and Jim Larkin were centrally involved in the planning and organisation of it. So it's 1907. It is 9 years before the Easter Rising in Dublin. And he said Connolly and Larkin had two right-hand men who were dockers in the Dockers Union. And they were called John and James Flanagan. One lived in Garmoyle Street and one lived round the corner in Pilot Street. These streets are still there. He said, I think they were related to Ronnie Flanigan. So there was only one way for me to find out, was to get word in to Ronnie Flanigan through the press office. Was it possible that he was related to them? So the man I asked was a veteran, a press officer called Dave Hanna. And he said, yeah, I don't know about this. He said, but I can tell you one thing. Ronnie Flanigan came from a Labour background. And he said, so it could well be true. So we examined it. And I eventually got speaking to Ronnie Flanigan about it. And he told me, he said, Hugh, you're quite right. He said, John Flanagan was my grandfather. And he lived in the same house as Ronnie and his brothers in a street called Ballymoney Street. There's several streets in the Old Park area of Belfast where Flanagan was brought up. They know them as the Bally Streets. So he lived in Ballymoney Street. And he said, my memory of my grandfather was that he spent a lot of time in bed because he was a very old man. And he said, but he was the kind of street socialist. There was a stream of people coming to the house to get forms filled in or applications made for some kind of state benefit. And grandfather Flanagan did all this from his own bed in the same house that Ronnie lived in. So I found that very, very interesting. But knowing my understanding of Flanagan as a policeman, and as I say, he deserves his moment in history because he was the last chief constable of the RUC, and he was the first chief constable of the PSNI. That is a special place in history. So he knew the Old Park area like the back of his hand. That's where he grew up. And much younger than him, of course, brought up in Alloa Street, which the people there call Aloha Street. It was John James Adair, and living not too far away in Louisa Street was Sam Skelly McCrory. And they went on to establish themselves as two of the most dangerous loyalist paramilitaries ever in the history of Northern Ireland. They were separately sent to jail for. Skelly went to jail for conspiracy to murder, and he received a 16-year sentence. Adair was charged with directing terrorism, and he too was sent to jail for 16 years. But my examination of it is Ronnie Flanigan handpicked the detectives to go after Adair. It was he rightly deduced that Adair was the engine that kept this machine going, and he determined to do something about it, and he handpicked the right men for the job. Down the country, some Republican was charged with directing terrorism. They got that through the courts, and the court accepted it. So they knew that they could do the same with Adair if they had the right evidence, which they eventually got. And Johnny Adair changed his plea to guilty. That was a bit of a surprise, though, but he changed his plea to guilty. So it's my view that Ronnie Flanigan was appalled by what these guys were doing on the same streets that he grew up in as a child, and he wanted them off the streets.
So Johnny wasn't the first to be charged.
No, no, no. It's in the book, the name of the other man. Everyone thinks it's Johnny because he was high profile, but there was a poor old Republican down the country was charged with it. But that was just to see if they could get it through the courts, and they did. So it was soon, not long after that, Mr. Adair was arrested and charged with it.
I won't keep you too much longer. I do appreciate all the time you spent. Can you tell us about the time someone gave you a box when you were doorstepping? I think a member of the Glenanne gang, the so-called Glenanne gang.
Oh, the Glenanne gang, yeah. See, that terminology is not used so much up here. If someone gives you a box, and it tends to really be a box, you know. You mean a punch? Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, there was a senior member of the Glenanne gang, a former police officer, and I had spoken to him on two occasions, and he told me that yes, he had been involved, but it wasn't something that was to be taken seriously. He had been involved in an incident where there was a hoax bomb, he said, placed in a pub, and he had been involved in that. That's all he told me that. So then I went away, and then I found out no, it was much more than that. Was a man had died in this explosion in the bar. That he had been involved in the bombing to some role or other, and I decided that I would go back and show him the evidence that I had acquired about him, and I went with my colleague Connor McCalley, photographer, and I said to him, "You wait here." It was like a big house, and we were parking area at the back, and I walked towards the back door, and he could see me coming. He was inside his house, and he walked to the door to meet me, and I said to him, "You lied to me. You lied to me." And what do you mean? And I said, "I've got evidence here that shows the bomb that you were involved in wasn't a hoax bomb. It was a real bomb. In fact, someone was seriously injured and later died as a result of this. So you were lying to me. So I saw him look around and he thought, because he couldn't see just the way the light was, he couldn't see into the car. And he looked around quickly and then punched me and he knocked me right back because I didn't anticipate it coming. It knocked me right back. So I decided to cut my losses and he was coming again to hit me again. But I headed for the car and I saw him stop when I got to the passenger side. He was clearly wondering why I wasn't getting in the driver's side. And at that, Connor opened the driver's door and said to him, "What are you at?" And it. So then he realised that I wasn't on my own, and I knew the delay of Connor getting out the car was he must have been taking a picture of me. First thing he thought of doing was taking a picture, not coming to my aid. That was secondary. And so as we drove out, I said to Connor, "Did you get that?" He said, "Well, that's what delayed me a bit there." So I said, "That's good." I said he was going on page 8 and 9, but I think now he'll go on page 1, and that's exactly what we did. We put him on page 1.
What's his name? I guess you can say it considering you published his picture.
What's what?
Fellow who did it. What's his name?
His name? It's on the tip of my tongue there.
It wasn't
Mac.
John Clear, no.
Uh, I just can't remember his name, but
But but
he
it
was
wasn't John
named
Weir.
what?
Not John Weir, no.
No, not John Weir. No, no, no. He knew him all right. I just forget this guy's name.
I
Uh,
know about it. No,
but
no
he was
about
named all right.
I know about it at all. Oh yeah, I did want to ask you. Does it, as a journalist, like, does it bother you on any level that that people would take a lot less seriously what gets printed in the Sunday World as opposed to like a broad what's it called a broadsheet newspaper? Like me myself, like even when I'm doing research, like if I see something in the Sunday World, I'll take it with much more of a grain of salt than I would have, in like the Irish Times or something like that.
Well, I know what you're getting at there. There's nothing I can do about that. All I can do is give my own commitment to doing the stories as best I can. I think it's a natural thing because of the way tabloid newspapers emerged, that they were often seen in newspapers like the Daily Sport and things. I mean, I remember watching a documentary on them, and they had a front page headline about a woman who thought her son had turned into a fish finger, you know, and it was put forward as a serious story. And the editor instructed one of his reporters to go and buy a box of fish fingers and put them down in front of her, see if she could pick out her son, you know. So that that doesn't really endear the readers to your newspaper being all that serious.
Of course,
So
of course, and,
it
and there's
was,
the likes of it's probably not you who does it, but like you see these really silly headlines that that they'll be like way I can't think of any off the top of my head, but like way over the top. So I'd even call them childish sometimes. These like attention grabbing headlines.
yeah, and that was all. That was a kind of particularly, forgive me for saying, but it was a particularly English style of tabloid newspaper. Our newspaper emerged in its own way as the first sort of Sunday tabloid, but there's an Irish dimension to it, which keeps it separate from the English tabloids.
Very good. Again, no, I almost finished about the last question. Is there any okay, given that you're way deeper in this world than most, and you have access to, we'll say, information that hasn't ever made it to the light of day or can't be printed or that kind of thing. Given your inside knowledge, like, are there any prevailing narratives about the conflict that most people believe that aren't true, or even just incidences that people have a certain idea about but are incorrect based on your more in-depth knowledge?
And you're quite right. There are things that have not emerged, particularly in reference to the peace process, uh, that will not be made public in the near future. Uh, I'll give you an example. The Reevy brothers, killing of the Reevy brothers, which involved people who were the Glenanne gang. I mean, the the government has slapped a ban that the details, the full details of the Glenanne gang will not emerge for 70 years. I mean, so maybe more than that, but certainly in that region. And that tells you that there are things the government, even now, you know, don't 30 years after the ceasefires, don't want the public to know. I'm aware of a number of things, and very recently I was made aware of a very important ingredient in the peace process, but I just can't reveal it because it would put some people at risk. So hopefully, in time to come, all of this uh, will emerge because it's the only way people, especially people who lost members of their family in this conflict. Conflict seems an inadequate word at times, John, but people who lost members of their family deserve to know the full truth, but they're not going to learn it for many years to come.
Am I correct in saying that the upcoming, it should be published soon enough, but this Operation Denton,
Yeah,
I think it does focus on this kind of broad group we know as the Glennon Gang, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully that, and certainly, I mean, the current chief constable, John Boucher, PSNI, his Canova team did a great job collecting information and identifying things that were previously not uh, not made available. If even half of that is able to be revealed to the public, will be going a long way towards making people feel that the loved ones, and often they did die in vain. They were unfortunately died maybe the wrong place at the wrong time, or to cover up something else. Often this type of thing happened, but I want more people to learn things that they didn't know. Them the brighter the light that shines upon these things, the better.
Sorry, I think I'm correct in saying like the full Canova report hasn't come out yet.
Oh no, only a partial, but it's due out very very soon. Yeah,
God, I mean, they've been saying that. I don't know how long it's been delayed for. It's a bloody
yeah, exactly. And why is it delayed?
sort of reasons and all.
Yeah, I think the chief constable is a good man and a good detective, and I think he's doing a good job.
Were you happy with what came out in the first report? Because to my mind, it was just acknowledging really the most basic stuff that everyone kind of knew anyway. Like,
Yeah, well, it wasn't enough. It certainly wasn't enough. But I know that in the build up and the collation of the information, they did a good job. So it's whether the government agrees to release it in the form that John Boucher wanted it released in. That's that's the crucial matter for the near future.
speaking of that awful Reeve brothers murder, I'll actually be interviewing Eugene When he gets some time, he's doing he's doing a lot of book tours, a lot of these.
Book events. Yeah, I've been at
In
a
fact,
few.
Boucher, I thought Boucher was at one of them. That surprised me.
I was at the same one as him. I was at the same one as him. See,
Jesus.
it was to do with an incident where a long time after the what was the incident? The Kings Mills massacre. The Reevy brothers were murdered, and the next night, the Protestant workers had gone home from work at the factory in Glenanne. Their minibus was stopped, and 10 of them were shot dead by the IRA using a cover name. And many years later, Ian Paisley stood up in the House of Commons and using evidence supplied to him by Willie Fraser, named Eugene Reevy as having been seen directing traffic at the scene of the Kingsmill massacre. And the thing was, it was true. But the truth of the matter was, Eugene Reevy was on his way to the hospital to collect the bodies of two of his brothers to bring back to the family home for a wake when they stumbled across the Kingsmill massacre, which had just happened minutes before. At first, Eugene thought it was cows that had got out of a field and been hit by cars. And the guys who were with him jumped out to assist. But it's only when they were out in the road they realised what had happened. These weren't dead cows, these were dead human beings. And Eugene then set about getting cars moved to allow emergency vehicles access to see if there was any assistance could be given to the people who were shot. And so that was Eugene's involvement in it. And Paisley was supplied by wrong information, forged information, supposedly Ulster Defence Regiment intelligence documents. So, and Mrs. Reevy, Eugene's mother, who was alive, later told me that the accusation, the false accusation made against her son Eugene, was worse than losing her three sons to the gunmen.
Jesus Christ, God! That what that family went through was horrific.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for staying as long as you have. Great interview. I appreciate everything. Just as a final parting word, is there anything you want to drop in that we didn't get around to, or just something to leave the listeners with?
Well, yeah. Well, the only one thing I would say, John, is uh, this place, i.e., Northern Ireland, survived the Troubles. And we survived, I believe, because there are more decent people than evil living here. And hopefully, as the years go on, that will be more evident. Things may change here. There may be constitutional change, which is fine as long as it's as a result of democratic vote. But it should always remember there are more good people here than people who were prepared to turn to violence.
I was going to say much more than more. I think there's a ratio of like probably 98 to 2 or
Yeah,
99 to 1. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
that's right.
Do you think we're seeing a united Ireland in your lifetime or maybe in mine?
Maybe I don't know. I blow hot and cold on whether it will be or whether it won't. Uh, I think it will happen, but it won't happen without violence emanating from loyalist groups.
Okay, as in order to prevent it from happening or
Yes,
after it
yeah,
happened?
no, well, either, both, probably, you know, and and that's a question, I mean, it's been pointed out to me by some of the people who might be involved in it that you only need a small group of uh, dissidents, whether it be loyalist or Republican, to have a serious problem on your hands. And
Uh,
that's a question as much for the Republic, for the 26 counties, as it is for anyone up here.
as in, would nationalists from the 26 counties use it as an opportunity to enact violence on what is now a
No, no, no. I mean, it would be part of it would be a problem for a. I mean, the Republic of Ireland is a peaceful democratic state, and I mean, there's a view. Some people, particularly in England, places like that, they don't really understand Ireland. They think people in the Republic are wandering around all day with smiles on their faces, saying "top of the morning" and things like that. But you and I know that actually doesn't happen. So I think people who are citizens in the democratic Republic of Ireland would need to think twice about whether they want a section of their country to be an unhappy place as a result of loyalist violence. So that's it.
Okay, interesting. Thank you very much now for everything. I appreciate all the time you spent with us and everything you shared. Hugh Jordan, thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you.